physical world enters our mind through our 5 sense organs. In the mind it is processed, compared, and the information is given to the sensitive points in the brain, then to the nervous system, then again to the sense organs, and our body reacts accordingly. This is how the process of knowing takes place in ordinary life. Now, when explained from the Vedantic point of view, what happens is, whenever we see an object, immediately the image of that object goes to the mind. Due to the presence of the image of that object, a mental wave appears in the mind. The mental waves may be called as mental ripples. It is nothing but the modification of the mind according to the image. The appearance of this mental wave in the mind is called in Vedantic terms as a vritti. A single mental wave pervades the mind at a time. That is why we are able to think only about one thought at a time. The arising of the mental wave in the mind is called vritti vyapti. That is the technical term used for it according to Vedanta. Mind has a unique quality. It can reflect pure consciousness. The consciousness which we experience at present, our present awareness is that reflected consciousness. It is not the pure consciousness. We experience our consciousness at this present state. This is the reflected consciousness. And the reflection of this consciousness is called Chitabhasa. What happens is, this reflected consciousness illumines the vritti as soon as the vritti arises. The illumining of the vritti by the reflected consciousness is called phala vyapti. So to know about an object, 2 things have to happen. The first is vritti vyapti and the next is the phala vyapti. This is what happens in the Jagrat Avastha, in our waking state. The same thing happens in the dream state also, in the Swapna Avastha. In the dream state, the image of the objects in the dream, it makes some modification in the mind, and as soon as these vrittis, that is in the dream when it arises, the reflected consciousness illumines it. Only then we are aware of our dreams. Even in the Jagrat Avastha, in the waking state, if the reflected consciousness does not illumine the vrittis, that is the modification of the mind, we will not be aware of that vritti. That is why when we go out or when we may see many objects, but the mind focuses only on some objects only. Our concentration goes only to some objects, and that vrittis will be illumined by the reflected consciousness. That's how we have knowledge about only some objects, even though when we see a lot of objects. So this happens in the waking state as well as in the dream state. We are aware of the dream only because the reflected consciousness illumines the vrittis in the dream. But what happens in the deep sleep state is, in the Sushupti Avastha is, the mind is shut down. There are no vrittis in the mind, but the reflected consciousness is always present. The reflected consciousness illumines the absence of the vrittis. That is why we do not feel anything in the deep sleep state. Or we feel only an emptiness. Even when we come to the Jagrat Avastha, we feel only an emptiness or a darkness about our deep sleep state. This is how, according to Vedanta, happens in the normal life in the 3 states. Now what happens in the mind of a Brahmajnani? When we want to get knowledge in Brahmajnana, that is when we focus our mind on Brahmajnana, Initially, we get information through scriptures, or we may read the scriptures, or we may get information from our guru. All these informations, they create vrittis in the mind. So the vritti is about Brahman. The modification of the mind is about the pure consciousness. These vrittis are called Brahmakara vrittis. The vrittis about Brahman is called the Brahmakara vrittis. The reflected consciousness illumines these Brahmakara vrittis. And in the initial stage, there will be vrittis about the worldly life also. But when we advance, the mind becomes pure. In the pure mind, the Brahmakara vrittis will be very powerful. Almost only the Brahmakara vrittis will be present in the mind. So the reflected consciousness is no longer needed to illumine these vrittis about Brahman. It is not needed. It is just like seeing the sunlight with a torchlight in the bright daylight. So it is no more needed. For worldly vrittis, the reflected consciousness is needed. But to illumine the Brahmakara vrittis, the reflected consciousness is no more needed. And it is directly illumined by Brahman, the pure consciousness. And it is at this stage, at this point, the reflected consciousness loses its individual identity. That's why we say that at this stage, the reflected consciousness, that is the Chidabhasa, merges with Brahman. It knows about its own self and it merges with Brahman. It is no more needed to illumine these Brahmakara vrittis. At this stage, that is the advanced stage, a jnani feels that he is not dual. He is not different from any of the objects, and he doesn't feel the presence of the worldly vrittis. Because they are not there. It is completely covered by the Brahmakara vrittis. He feels that he is non-dual and he is one with all this universe. This is how Vedanta philosophy uses knowledge in the path of realization. The yoga philosophy or the other philosophy may have different views, but this is how Vedanta philosophy uses knowledge to attain Brahman. Thank you for watching.